Welcome, weary traveler, to the crimson-shadowed realm where ambition carved kingdoms from suffering and magic became both salvation and damnation. Tonight, we journey through the complete chronicles of Thay, a land where red-robed wizards transformed from rebels into tyrants, where the pursuit of immortality consumed entire civilizations, and where the very fabric of magic was woven with threads of domination and despair. Let the distant glow of volcanic peaks guide you as we explore the rise and reign of the Red Wizards, a tale spanning centuries of conquest, corruption, and the eternal hunger for power that defines the human condition. The Crimson Revolution that would reshape the Eastern realms forever began not with grand declarations or dramatic battles, but with whispered conversations in hidden chambers beneath the very temples where Mulhorandi priests proclaimed the eternal dominance of their god-kings. In the year 922, the accumulated grievances of centuries finally crystallized into action, as scattered cells of Mulan wizards coordinated their efforts across the vast plateau that would one day bear their name. The spark that ignited this conflagration came from an unlikely source, a young apprentice scribe named Thay, whose hands bore the telltale burn scars of magical experimentation conducted in secret. Working in the Great Library of Skuld, the Mulhorandi capital's repository of divine knowledge, he had access to texts that revealed the true scope of his people's magical potential. The priests taught that arcane magic was a lesser power, a pale reflection of divine authority that should be regulated and controlled. But the ancient texts told a different story, speaking of mortal wizards who had once commanded forces that rivaled the gods themselves. The realization that his people's magical heritage had been deliberately suppressed ignited a rage in Third that would burn for the rest of his unnaturally extended life. Night after night, he copied forbidden passages onto scraps of papyrus, memorizing incantations that had been banned for centuries, teaching himself the fundamental principles of spellcraft that the Mulhorandi educational system had systematically excluded from native instruction. When his activities were discovered by a temple guard, the resulting confrontation left 3 men dead and launched Thay into a life of rebellion from which there would be no return. The fugitive scribe's first act of organized resistance was to seek out others like himself, Mulan citizens who possessed arcane talent but had been denied proper training, forced to develop their abilities in secret or abandon them entirely. He found them working as minor functionaries in government offices, as craftsmen whose work bore subtle magical enhancements they dared not acknowledge, as healers who used arcane techniques disguised as folk remedies. Each possessed fragments of knowledge that, when combined, began to form a coherent system of magical instruction that could rival anything the Mulhorandi priest schools offered. The early meetings of these proto-red wizards took place in abandoned quarries outside major cities, in forgotten crypts beneath ancient temples, in the basements of sympathetic merchants who had grown wealthy trading magical components despite official restrictions. The discussions that occurred during these clandestine gatherings were both practical and philosophical, addressing not only specific techniques for advancing their magical studies, but fundamental questions about the relationship between arcane and divine power, between individual achievement and collective responsibility, between the rights of the talented and the needs of the many. Thay emerged as a natural leader among these rebels, not because of superior magical ability, though his skills were considerable, but because of his vision for what their scattered resistance could become. He spoke eloquently of a land governed by those who understood magic's true potential, where arcane research would be funded and encouraged rather than suppressed, where a person's social status would be determined by their magical accomplishment rather than their family's relationship to the ruling priests. The dream he articulated was seductive in its promise of recognition and power for those who had been forced to hide their greatest talents. The transformation from philosophical discussion group to armed rebellion required catalysts that went beyond mere intellectual disagreement with Mulhorandi policy. The first came in the form of increasingly harsh crackdowns on suspected magical practitioners, as the priest kings became aware that underground networks of wizards were developing throughout their territory. Raids on suspected meeting places, arrests of anyone caught with banned magical materials, public executions of those convicted of practicing unauthorized magic. All of these measures created martyrs and intensified the commitment of surviving rebels. The second catalyst was the discovery of a cache of ancient Netherese magical texts in a previously unknown chamber of the ruins near what would later become El Taba. These scrolls, preserved by magical stasis for millennia, contained detailed instructions for magical techniques that far exceeded anything the underground wizards had previously imagined possible. More importantly, they provided historical evidence that arcane magic had once been the dominant force in the region, that the divine hierarchy currently in power was itself a relatively recent development in the broader sweep of magical history. Armed with this knowledge, and driven by growing desperation as Mulhorandi persecution intensified, the rebel wizards began to coordinate their activities on a scale that transformed individual acts of defiance into a coherent military campaign. The adoption of red robes as a symbol of their movement was both practical and symbolic. Practical because it allowed rebels to identify each other in the chaos of battle. Symbolic because the color represented the blood they were prepared to shed for their cause, and the flames of magical energy they wielded against their oppressors. The first major engagement of the revolution took place at the fortress of Theala, a Mulhorandi stronghold that controlled a crucial mountain pass connecting the eastern plateau to the empire's heartland. The rebel assault demonstrated tactical innovations that would characterize their entire campaign: the coordinated use of multiple schools of magic to overcome traditional defensive strategies, the employment of summoned creatures to supplement their limited numbers, the careful timing of attacks to exploit the specific vulnerabilities of divine magic. The battle itself lasted 3 days and nights, with waves of Mulhorandi reinforcements arriving only to find that conventional military tactics were ineffective against opponents who could reshape the very battlefield through magical manipulation. Walls that had stood for centuries crumbled under carefully placed disintegration spells, while illusory duplicates of the fortress confused relief columns and led them into carefully prepared ambushes. When the dust settled, the red-robed rebels had claimed their first significant victory and demonstrated that their movement possessed the strategic sophistication necessary for sustained military action. The psychological impact of Thesalha's fall reverberated throughout the Mulhorandi Empire and beyond. For the first time in living memory, a group of arcane practitioners had successfully challenged divine authority through direct military action and emerged victorious. The victory attracted new recruits to the rebel cause, while simultaneously convincing some Mulhorandi officials that negotiation might be preferable to continued warfare. However, the most significant consequence was the effect on the rebels themselves, who began to see their struggle not merely as resistance to oppression but as the beginning of a new order based on magical supremacy. The organizational structure that emerged from this early victory would define Thayan society for centuries to come. The rebel leadership naturally divided itself according to specialization in different schools of magic, with each group developing its own internal hierarchy based on magical ability and strategic contribution to the revolution. The most powerful practitioners in each school became the first Zulkirs, though that title would not be formalized until later, while lesser wizards formed the administrative and military backbone of the growing movement. The decision to restrict full membership in their organization to those of Mulan blood was born from practical considerations rather than racial ideology. The rebels needed to distinguish between potential allies and possible Mulhorandi infiltrators, and ethnicity provided a readily identifiable marker of loyalty. However, this practical expedient would evolve into a fundamental principle of Thayan society that would have profound consequences for the region's future development. As the rebellion spread beyond its original centers of support, the character of the resistance began to change in ways that reflected both the corrupting influence of power and the practical necessities of governing territory. Villages that welcomed the rebels were rewarded with protection and favorable treatment, while those that resisted faced consequences that often exceeded the harshness of Mulhorandi rule. The idealistic vision of magical liberation that had motivated the original conspirators was gradually replaced by a more pragmatic understanding of power that prioritized control over justice. The siege of Delhumide marked a turning point in the revolution's moral trajectory. The city had served as a major administrative center for the Mulhorandi Empire, and its capture would provide the rebels with access to treasury records, tax collection systems, and communication networks that could accelerate their conquest of the entire region. However, the civilian population was overwhelmingly loyal to the old regime and actively supported the Mulhorandi garrison's resistance efforts. The rebel solution to this problem was both effective and morally troubling. Rather than accepting the heavy casualties that would result from a direct assault, they employed magical means to terrorize the civilian population into submission. Nightmares plagued the sleep of every resident, while illusions made the city's food and water supplies appear contaminated with filth and disease. The psychological warfare was so effective that the city surrendered within a week, but the methods used established precedents for the use of magic as a tool of oppression rather than liberation. The aftermath of Delhumide's capitulation revealed another disturbing trend in the revolution's evolution. The rebel administrators who took control of the city proved to be as interested in personal enrichment as in political reform. The wealth that had once flowed to Mulhorandi temples was redirected to fund magical research and military expansion, but significant portions also disappeared into private coffers. The corruption that infected the revolutionary movement at this early stage would metastasize into the systematic exploitation that would characterize mature Thayan society. Yet, for all their moral failings and growing corruption, the rebel wizards continued to achieve remarkable military and magical successes that validated their central claim about the superiority of arcane power. The great ritual that sealed their victory over the Mulhorandi Empire took place on the anniversary of their first meeting, when the 8 most powerful rebel leaders performed a coordinated magical working that simultaneously struck at Mulhorandi power centers throughout the region. The ritual itself was a masterwork of cooperative magical engineering, requiring precise timing and flawless execution from participants separated by hundreds of miles. Each Zulkir contributed their specialized knowledge to a working that targeted the divine magic sustaining Mulhorandi rule, severing the connections between the empire's local administrators and the deity-powered authorities in the distant capital. The immediate effect was chaos throughout the Mulhorandi colonial administration, as local officials found themselves cut off from the divine guidance that had directed their decisions for generations. The long-term consequences were even more significant. The successful completion of such a complex magical undertaking demonstrated that the rebel wizards had achieved a level of coordination and technical sophistication that rivaled the greatest magical civilizations of the past. More importantly, it established the principle of collective magical action that would become fundamental to Thayan society, the idea that individual achievement could be multiplied through careful cooperation with others who possessed complementary skills. The formal declaration of independence that followed the great ritual was both triumph and tragedy, marking the achievement of everything the original rebels had fought for while simultaneously revealing how far they had traveled from their initial idealistic vision. The document itself was a masterwork of political rhetoric that spoke eloquently of liberation, self-determination, and the natural right of the magically talented to govern their own affairs. Yet the society they had created was already showing signs of the authoritarianism and casual cruelty that would define its future development. The choice of Eltabar as the new nation's capital reflected both practical considerations and symbolic aspirations. The city's location, at the confluence of several major trade routes, made it an ideal administrative center, while its proximity to the ruins where they had discovered the Netherese texts connected their new government to the greatest magical civilization in recorded history. The construction projects that began immediately after independence demonstrated both the scope of their ambitions and their willingness to employ forced labor to achieve their goals. The first laws enacted by the newly established Council of Zulkirs revealed the extent to which the revolutionary leadership had been transformed by their experience of wielding power. The restrictions on wearing red robes, the regulations governing magical practice, the legal codes that established different punishments for different social classes, all of these measures were designed to preserve the authority of the ruling wizards rather than to protect the rights of ordinary citizens. Yet even as they established the framework for what would become one of history's most oppressive magical tyrannies, the founders of Thay genuinely believed they were creating something revolutionary and beneficial. Their magical schools would advance human understanding of arcane forces. Their research programs would unlock secrets that had been lost for millennia. Their society would demonstrate the superiority of merit-based governance over traditional hereditary systems. The tragedy of the Red Wizards was not that they were motivated by pure evil, but that their noble aspirations were corrupted by the very power they had sought to use for constructive purposes. As the dust of revolution settled and the work of nation-building began in earnest, the 8 schools of magic that had coordinated the rebellion began to consolidate into the rigid hierarchical system that would define Thayan society for centuries to come. Each school developed its own internal culture, its own traditions of advancement and recognition, its own interpretation of what it meant to serve the greater good through magical excellence. Yet beneath the surface of this apparent diversity lay a growing uniformity of thought that prioritized power over compassion, efficiency over justice, and magical achievement over human dignity. The revolution that had begun with whispered dreams of freedom had created a society where freedom was reserved for the few who possessed both magical talent and the ruthlessness necessary to exploit others. The crimson robes that had once symbolized defiance against tyranny had become the uniform of a new form of oppression, one that was perhaps more efficient and certainly more durable than the divine authority it had replaced. In achieving everything they had originally fought for, the Red Wizards had lost sight of why those goals had once seemed worthy of the enormous sacrifices they had demanded. The decade following Thay's declaration of independence revealed the true nature of the revolutionary movement that had overthrown Mullarandi rule. As the idealistic rhetoric of liberation gave way to the harsh realities of governing a territory whose very foundation rested upon the systematic exploitation of those deemed magically inferior, the Red Wizards, who had once spoken eloquently of freedom from oppression, now found themselves creating new forms of bondage that would prove far more efficient and enduring than anything their predecessors had devised. The first invasion of Rashemen in the year 934 demonstrated both the ambitions and the limitations of the newly established bureaucracy. The decision to launch this campaign so soon after independence was driven by a combination of strategic necessity and ideological fervor, as the Zulkirs recognized that their revolutionary government needed military victories to maintain legitimacy, while simultaneously proving the superiority of arcane power over traditional forms of governance. Rashemen presented an attractive target for several reasons that seemed to justify the enormous risks involved in launching a major military campaign while their own borders remained incompletely pacified. The land was rich in natural resources that could fund further expansion. Its population included significant numbers of potential slaves to fuel Thay's labor-intensive magical industries, and its defeat would establish a crucial buffer zone between Thay and the remaining Mullarandi territories to the south. More importantly, from the perspective of Red Wizard ideology, Rashemen was governed by a system that represented everything they opposed. A traditional society where divine magic held sway over arcane knowledge, where women held political authority based on religious rather than magical credentials, and where folk customs took precedence over rational administrative efficiency. The conquest of such a realm would validate their fundamental beliefs about the natural superiority of wizard rule, while providing a demonstration of arcane power that would discourage resistance from other potential enemies. The military preparations for the Rashemen campaign revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of Thayan's society in its formative period. The Red Wizards had developed innovative magical tactics that could devastate traditional armies, but their forces lacked the discipline and coordination that came from generations of military tradition. Their magical research had produced powerful enchantments and devastating spells, but they had limited experience in the logistics of supplying large armies across hostile territory. The invasion force that crossed into Rashemen territory consisted of approximately 15,000 troops, including significant numbers of summoned creatures, magically enhanced human soldiers, and contingents of enslaved humanoids who served as expendable assault troops. The magical support for this army was unprecedented in the region's military history, with nearly 200 Red Wizards of various ranks providing everything from battlefield enchantments to strategic reconnaissance through divination magic. The early stages of the campaign proceeded according to plan, with Thayan forces achieving a series of victories that seemed to validate their confidence in magical superiority. The Rashemite defenders, while brave and determined, were simply unprepared for the kind of warfare that the Red Wizards brought to bear against them. Traditional fortifications proved useless against teleportation magic. Conventional tactics failed against opponents who could fly or turn invisible at will, and Rashemi morale suffered under the psychological impact of facing enemies who commanded forces beyond mortal understanding. The siege of Imlidar, Rashemen's capital, became the climactic engagement of the entire campaign and ultimately the source of its catastrophic failure. The city's defenders, led by the Iron Lord Thazar and supported by the legendary Witchlaran witches, employed a combination of divine magic and folk traditions that the Thayan wizards had dismissed as primitive superstition. The result was a lesson in the dangers of underestimating opponents whose power derived from sources different from one's own. The Witchlaran's ability to command the loyalty of Rashemen's animal population transformed the battlefield in ways that no amount of magical preparation had anticipated. Wolves descended from the forests in numbers that defied natural explanation, while bears emerged from hibernation to assault Thayan's supply lines. The very land itself seemed to rise against the invaders, as weather patterns shifted to create blizzards that grounded flying creatures and floods that swept away carefully positioned siege equipment. More devastating still was the witches' mastery of divination magic that operated according to principles the Red Wizards could not counter or even fully understand. Their elaborate plans, developed through months of careful preparation, seemed to be anticipated by defenders who responded to threats before they materialized. Surprise attacks found empty positions, while carefully planned ambushes walked into prepared counter-ambushes that suggested enemy knowledge of Thayan intentions that bordered on prescience. The psychological impact of fighting opponents who seemed to possess supernatural awareness of their every move gradually eroded the confidence that had sustained the Thayan forces through the campaign's early successes. Soldiers who had believed themselves part of an inevitable conquest began to whisper about curses and supernatural vengeance, while even the Red Wizards found themselves questioning whether their magical superiority was as absolute as they had assumed. The breaking point came during the third month of the siege, when a coordinated assault by all remaining Thayan forces was met by a defense that seemed to know exactly when and where each attack would fall. The slaughter that followed was so complete that fewer than 3,000 of the original invasion force survived to retreat across the border, While the magical artifacts and research materials captured by Rashemi forces represented decades of accumulated knowledge and irreplaceable resources, the defeat at Imlidar sent shockwaves throughout Thayan society that went far beyond the immediate military consequences. The myth of Red Wizard invincibility, carefully cultivated during the successful revolution against Mullarandi rule, lay in ruins alongside the bodies of hundreds of their most accomplished practitioners. The economic cost of the failed campaign strained the young nation's resources to the breaking point, while the loss of so many experienced wizards created gaps in the hierarchy that would take generations to fill. More fundamentally, the failure in Rashemen forced a comprehensive re-evaluation of Thayan's strategic thinking that would influence the nation's development for centuries to come. The assumption that magical power automatically translated into military dominance proved to be dangerously naive, while the belief that traditional societies were inherently inferior to wizard rule required significant modification in light of their devastating defeat. The lessons learned from the Rashemen disaster shaped the military reforms that followed, as surviving Zolkirs recognized that their armed forces required fundamental restructuring if they were to achieve their expansionist goals. The integration of conventional military tactics with magical enhancement became a priority, while the recruitment and training of non-magical soldiers received attention that had been neglected during the revolutionary period. The establishment of permanent military academies marked a significant shift in Thayan priorities, as resources that had previously been devoted exclusively to magical research were redirected toward developing professional officer corps capable of coordinating complex operations involving both arcane and mundane forces. The curriculum at these institutions emphasized not only tactical knowledge but also the psychological principles necessary for maintaining discipline among troops who might be called upon to fight alongside summoned demons or undead creatures. The slave-based economy that emerged during this period of military reorganization was justified as a temporary expedient necessary to rebuild Thayan's strength, but it quickly became entrenched as the foundation of the entire social system. The labor required for the massive construction projects, mining operations, and agricultural expansion that would fund future military campaigns was simply too extensive to be provided by free workers, particularly given the heavy casualties suffered during the Rashemen expedition. The moral corruption that accompanied this economic transformation was gradual but inexorable, as red wizards who had once fought against oppression became the architects of a system that reduced human beings to the status of livestock. The rationalizations developed to justify this reversal of their original principles revealed the capacity for self-deception that would characterize Thayan leadership throughout its history. The argument that slavery was necessary for the greater good of magical advancement became a cornerstone of Red Wizard ideology, supported by elaborate philosophical justifications that portrayed their exploitation of others as a form of enlightened stewardship. Those who possessed magical talent were naturally suited to rule, the theory claimed, while those lacking such abilities could best serve society through manual labor directed by their intellectual superiors. The practical implementation of this ideology required the development of sophisticated systems for identifying, capturing, and managing enslaved populations that would become models of efficiency copied by other slave-holding societies throughout the region. The magical techniques developed for controlling rebellious slaves, detecting escape attempts, and maintaining productivity through fear and intimidation represented innovations in the application of arcane power that demonstrated both the creativity and the cruelty of Red Wizard thinking. The expansion of Thayan territory during the decades following the Rashemen defeat was characterized by a cautious, methodical approach that contrasted sharply with the reckless ambition that had led to their earlier disaster. Rather than attempting to conquer entire nations through massive military campaigns, the Red Wizards focused on gradual territorial acquisition through a combination of diplomatic pressure, economic penetration, and limited military action against carefully selected targets. The conquest of the Wizard's Reach exemplified this new strategic approach, as Thayan forces systematically eliminated the isolated wizard lords who controlled various strongholds throughout the region rather than confronting them in a coordinated campaign. Each victory added territory, resources, and magical knowledge to the growing Thayan domain while avoiding the risks associated with fighting multiple enemies simultaneously. The integration of conquered territories into the Thayan system revealed both the adaptability and the ruthlessness of Red Wizard administration. Local populations were evaluated according to their potential contributions to the magical economy, with those possessing useful skills being incorporated into the labor force while others were sold to distant markets or simply eliminated if they represented potential security threats. The development of the great slave markets that would become central to Thayan commerce began during this period, as the steady flow of captives from military campaigns created surplus populations that could be profitably exported to other regions. The establishment of trading relationships with merchants from distant lands who were willing to overlook the moral implications of their business dealings in exchange for access to high-quality enslaved workers marked the beginning of Thay's transformation from isolated magical kingdom to major commercial power. The internal power struggles that characterized this period of expansion reflected the competitive nature of Red Wizard society, as individual Zulkirs sought to maximize their personal influence within the ruling council while simultaneously advancing their school's interests in the broader magical hierarchy. These conflicts, while destructive in the short term, ultimately strengthened the overall system by eliminating weaker leaders and promoting those with the cunning and determination necessary to thrive in an environment of constant political warfare. The school of necromancy's gradual ascendancy during this era was not yet the overwhelming dominance it would later achieve under Szass Tam's leadership, but the foundations for that future supremacy were being established through careful accumulation of resources and strategic alliance building with other schools. The necromancer's willingness to explore magical territories that other schools considered too dangerous or morally questionable gave them access to power sources that would prove crucial in later conflicts. The establishment of the great libraries and research facilities that would become legendary throughout the magical community represented perhaps the most positive achievement of early Thayan civilization. These institutions, funded by the wealth generated through territorial expansion and slave labor, attracted scholars from throughout the known world who were willing to overlook the moral failings of their patrons in exchange for access to resources and knowledge unavailable anywhere else. The magical innovations that emerged from these research programs advanced the entire field of arcane study in ways that benefited practitioners far beyond Thay's borders. Improvements in spell formulation, the development of new magical items, and the systematic cataloging of previously unknown phenomena created knowledge bases that would influence magical theory for centuries to come. Yet even these genuine contributions to human knowledge were tainted by the methods used to acquire them, as Thayan researchers routinely employed unwilling test subjects in experiments that would have been considered unconscionable by scholars operating under traditional ethical constraints. The advancement of magical understanding came at a cost measured in human suffering that raised fundamental questions about whether any achievement could justify such methods. The establishment of permanent diplomatic missions in major cities throughout the region marked Thay's emergence as a recognized power that could no longer be dismissed as a temporary aberration in the political landscape. These embassies, staffed by red wizards skilled in both magic and statecraft, served multiple functions as intelligence gathering centers, commercial offices, and bases for covert operations designed to advance Thayan interests through means other than direct military action. The cultural influence that Thay began to exert during this period was perhaps more significant than its military conquests, as foreign nobles competed to acquire Thayan magical items while scholars sought access to red wizard knowledge regardless of its moral implications. The gradual normalization of Thayan practices through commercial and intellectual exchange prepared the ground for later political developments that would extend Red Wizard influence far beyond their territorial borders. The transformation of the Red Wizards from revolutionary idealists to ruthless pragmatists was complete by the end of this formative period, as the demands of governing, expanding, and maintaining their magical supremacy had eliminated most traces of the principles that had originally motivated their rebellion against Mulorandi rule. The society they had created was undeniably powerful and remarkably innovative, but it was also fundamentally corrupted by the choices its leaders had made in pursuit of their ambitions. The legacy of this age of expansion would influence every subsequent phase of Thayan development, establishing patterns of behavior and institutional structures that would prove remarkably resistant to change even when their original justifications were no longer relevant. The Red Wizards had succeeded in creating a civilization capable of achieving their dreams of magical supremacy, but in doing so they had also created a system that would ultimately consume everything they claimed to value, including their own humanity. The time of troubles that began in 1358 brought chaos to every corner of Faerun, but nowhere did the cosmic upheaval create greater opportunities for ambitious expansion than in the realm of Thay. The Avatar Crisis, which saw gods walking the material plane in mortal form while their divine portfolios fell into disarray, represented exactly the kind of fundamental disruption that the Red Wizards had been waiting centuries to exploit. For a nation whose power rested upon arcane magic rather than divine favor, the temporary weakness of the gods offered unprecedented chances to settle old scores and claim new territories, while their enemies struggled to adapt to a world where prayer might go unanswered and divine intervention could no longer be counted upon. The initial reports of divine chaos reached the halls of El Taba through the extensive network of spies and informants that the Red Wizards maintained throughout the Eastern realms. The news that gods were manifesting as physical beings on the material plane, that clerics were losing access to their spells without warning, that the very nature of divine magic had become unreliable. All of this was received by the Zulkirs with the calculating satisfaction of chess masters who suddenly discovered that their opponents had been forced to play without half-base playing forced to play their pieces. The emergency council session that convened within hours of receiving confirmation of the crisis's scope brought together the most powerful Red Wizards from across the nation's territories. The debates that followed revealed both the strategic acumen and the moral bankruptcy that characterized Thayan leadership, as the assembled wizards coldly evaluated which neighboring powers would be most vulnerable to exploitation during the period of divine uncertainty. Aglarond, their traditional enemy to the west, had long relied upon a combination of divine magic and natural defenses to maintain its independence against Thayan expansion. The symbol, that realm's sorceress queen, was undeniably powerful in her own right, but her kingdom's military forces included significant numbers of clerics and paladins, whose effectiveness would be severely compromised by the disruption of divine magic. The strategic planners in El Taba calculated that a swift, coordinated assault during the early stages of the crisis might achieve in months what centuries of conventional warfare had failed to accomplish. Rashemen, despite the devastating defeat it had inflicted upon Thayan forces decades earlier, presented another tempting target during this period of divine weakness. The Witchlaran witches, who had proven so effective against Red Wizard magic, drew much of their power from connections to nature deities and primal spirits that might be disrupted by the cosmic chaos affecting all supernatural forces. The opportunity to finally settle the score for that humiliating military disaster was too appealing for many Zulkirs to resist, regardless of the strategic risks involved. The decision to launch simultaneous military campaigns against multiple enemies represented both the height of Thayan ambition and a dangerous overextension of resources that would ultimately limit the success of all their operations. The Red Wizards had grown accustomed to thinking in terms of magical superiority over conventional forces, but they had not adequately considered how their own magical capabilities might be affected by the cosmic disruptions that were wreaking havoc on divine magic throughout the planes. The Aglarond campaign began with early successes that seemed to validate the Zulka's strategic calculations. Thayan forces crossed the border in 3 coordinated columns, each supported by significant magical firepower and encountering resistance that was noticeably less organized than in previous conflicts. The symbol's attention appeared to be divided between defending her realm and investigating the magical phenomena that were affecting spellcasters throughout the region, creating opportunities for Thayan commanders to advance farther into enemy territory than any previous invasion had achieved. The capture of several border fortresses provided the Red Wizards with bases for further operations while also yielding prisoners whose interrogation revealed the extent to which Aglarond's defenses had been compromised by the divine crisis. Clerics who had once been capable of healing battlefield wounds or turning undead creatures were struggling to maintain access to even basic divine spells, while paladins reported that their supernatural abilities were functioning only intermittently. The siege of Velprintala, Aglarond's capital, represented the high water mark of Thayan's success during the entire Time of Troubles period. The city's defenses, formidable under normal circumstances, were weakened by the absence of several key defenders who had departed to investigate reports of divine manifestations elsewhere in the realm. The magical bombardment that preceded the assault was more devastating than anything the Red Wizards had previously achieved, as their spellcasters coordinated their efforts with a precision that reflected decades of tactical refinement. Yet, even as Thayan forces established siege lines around the capital, the strategic situation was beginning to shift in ways that would ultimately doom their ambitious campaigns. The cosmic forces that had disrupted divine magic were also affecting arcane magic in subtle but increasingly significant ways. Spells that should have functioned according to well-understood principles were producing unexpected results, while magical items were displaying erratic behavior that made them unreliable in critical situations. The phenomenon that Thayan scholars would later term wild magic surges began manifesting during the siege's 3rd week, as the concentrated arcane energies being employed by hundreds of Red Wizards interacted with the cosmic disruptions in ways that no amount of theoretical study had prepared them to anticipate. Fireballs that were intended to demolish specific sections of the city walls instead materialized in the midst of Thayan camps, while teleportation spells designed to insert strike teams behind enemy lines deposited their passengers in random locations, hundreds of miles from their intended destinations. The psychological impact of these magical failures on Thayan morale was devastating, as the Red Wizards' fundamental confidence in their arcane superiority began to erode under the pressure of repeated spell failures and unpredictable magical effects. The rigid hierarchy that governed Thayan society was based upon the premise that magical ability determined fitness to rule, but when magic itself became unreliable, the entire foundation of their civilization was called into question. The breakthrough that finally allowed Aglarond's forces to break the siege came not through military prowess, but through the symbol's innovative adaptation to the changed magical environment. Rather than attempting to work around the wild magic effects that were plaguing all spellcasters, she developed techniques for deliberately triggering and channeling these unpredictable energies into devastatingly effective attacks against the besieging forces. The magical storm that she unleashed upon the Thayan siege lines defied every principle of controlled spellcasting that the Red Wizards had spent centuries perfecting. Lightning struck targets with impossible precision, while simultaneously healing wounded defenders. Tornadoes materialized in clear skies to scatter enemy formations while leaving friendly forces untouched, and the very ground beneath Thayan encampments opened into temporary portals that deposited confused soldiers in distant wilderness areas. The retreat from Velprintala marked the beginning of a comprehensive Thayan withdrawal from Aglarond that would ultimately return the border to its pre-war position, despite the enormous resources that had been committed to the campaign. The lessons learned during this failed invasion would influence Red Wizard's strategic thinking for generations, particularly regarding the dangers of assuming that magical superiority alone could guarantee military success in circumstances where magic itself was unreliable. The simultaneous campaign against Rashemen proceeded according to a different timeline, but ultimately encountered similar problems as the cosmic disruptions that characterized the Time of Troubles began to affect all forms of supernatural power. The Thayan forces assigned to this operation had been specifically chosen for their experience with the unique challenges that Rashemi defenders presented, but they found themselves facing an enemy that had adapted to the changed magical environment even more effectively than the symbol had managed. The Witchlaren witches, whose power had traditionally derived from connections to nature spirits and primal forces, discovered that the cosmic chaos had actually enhanced their abilities in certain respects, while simultaneously freeing them from some of the traditional constraints that had limited their magical practices. The result was a form of wild, unpredictable magic that was perfectly suited to guerrilla warfare against invaders who relied upon carefully planned and precisely executed magical tactics. The forest battles that characterized the Rashemen campaign became legendary among military historians for their sheer chaotic unpredictability, as both sides found themselves adapting to a combat environment where traditional magical principles no longer applied. Thayan wizards who attempted to employ proven battlefield spells discovered that their magic might summon allied creatures, hostile entities, or nothing at all, depending upon factors that no amount of theoretical knowledge could predict or control. The Rashemi response to these conditions was to embrace the chaos rather than fight against it, developing combat techniques that incorporated wild magic effects as deliberate tactical elements rather than unwelcome complications. Their shamans learned to trigger magical surges at strategically advantageous moments, while their warriors adapted fighting styles that could take advantage of sudden environmental changes caused by unpredictable magical effects. The climactic battle of this campaign occurred in a forest clearing that had become saturated with wild magic energy, creating an environment where the normal laws of physics and magic interacted in ways that defied rational understanding. The Thayan force that entered this area consisted of nearly 500 experienced soldiers supported by dozens of red wizards, but within hours they found themselves scattered across multiple planes of existence, transformed into various animal forms, or simply disappeared entirely. The few survivors who managed to escape this magical disaster brought back reports that seemed too incredible to believe, describing combat conditions where the battlefield itself had become a living entity that actively participated in the fighting. Trees that moved independently to block Thayan's spells while providing cover for Rashemi warriors, stones that flew through the air to strike specific targets with impossible accuracy, weather patterns that changed from moment to moment in response to the tactical situation. All of these phenomena suggested that the cosmic forces unleashed during the Time of Troubles had transformed the very nature of magical age. Combat. The decision to abandon both campaigns simultaneously represented a humiliating admission of defeat that sent shockwaves throughout Thayan society. The Red Wizards, who had confidently predicted easy victories over enemies weakened by divine crisis, found themselves forced to explain how their own magical superiority had proven inadequate against opponents who had adapted more successfully to the changed supernatural environment. The internal conflicts that erupted within the Council of Zulkirs following these military disasters revealed the extent to which Thayan society depended upon continuous external success to maintain internal stability. Accusations of incompetence, cowardice, and outright treachery flew between different schools of magic as each sought to assign blame for the failed campaigns while protecting their own interests and reputations. The school of necromancy's response to this crisis would prove to be historically significant, as its leadership began developing theories about the relationship between the cosmic disruptions and the fundamental nature of undeath. The argument that undead creatures might be less affected by wild magic effects than living beings provided a rationale for increased experimentation with necromantic techniques during a period when other forms of magic were proving unreliable. The research programs that emerged from this theoretical framework would ultimately lay the groundwork for developments that would transform Thayan society over the following decades. The systematic study of how undead creatures interacted with wild magic effects revealed principles that would later be incorporated into more sophisticated necromantic techniques, while the practical experience of employing undead forces in unstable magical environments provided valuable insights into their potential military applications. The economic consequences of the failed campaigns extended far beyond the immediate costs of military equipment and personnel losses. The slave labor force that had been expanded in anticipation of administering conquered territories instead became a financial burden, while the magical resources that had been stockpiled for post-victory exploitation remained unused in heavily guarded warehouses. The disruption of normal trade relationships with neighboring powers created additional economic pressures that threatened the stability of the entire Thayan financial system. The innovative solutions that Red Wizard administrators developed to address these economic challenges demonstrated both the adaptability and the moral flexibility that characterized their approach to governance. The excess slave population was redirected toward massive construction projects that would provide long-term economic benefits, while the unused magical resources were employed in experimental research programs that might yield discoveries valuable enough to offset the campaign losses. The establishment of the first permanent Thayan enclaves outside their traditional borders during this period represented a strategic innovation that would have profound implications for the nation's future development. Rather than attempting to govern conquered territories directly, which had proven problematic during previous expansion attempts, the Red Wizards began establishing heavily fortified commercial outposts that could serve multiple functions simultaneously. These enclaves operated as trading posts for the export of Thayan magical goods, intelligence-gathering centers for monitoring political developments in host regions, recruitment stations for acquiring new slaves and magical resources, and demonstration sites where potential customers could observe Thayan magical capabilities firsthand. The legal and diplomatic arrangements that made such establishments possible required negotiations with local authorities who were often desperate for the economic benefits that Thayan trade could provide. The moral compromises that foreign rulers made to accommodate these enclaves revealed the extent to which Thayan economic power could achieve results that military conquest had failed to accomplish. City-states that had successfully resisted Thayan armies found themselves gradually becoming dependent upon Thayan magical goods, while regional powers that had maintained policies of non-cooperation with the Red Wizards discovered that their economic competitors were gaining significant advantages through Thayan trade relationships. The transformation of Thayan strategy from direct military conquest to economic penetration represented a fundamental shift in how the Red Wizards understood their relationship with the broader world. The lessons learned during the time of troubles had demonstrated that magical superiority alone was insufficient to guarantee military success, but they had also revealed opportunities for influence and control that did not require the risks and costs associated with conventional warfare. The intelligence networks that supported these new strategic approaches required significant investments in personnel and resources, but they provided information about foreign political developments, military capabilities, and economic conditions that proved invaluable for planning future operations. The Red Wizards who staffed these networks developed expertise in diplomacy, economics, and cultural analysis that complemented their magical abilities while providing career paths that did not require direct participation in combat operations. The gradual recovery from the disasters of the time of troubles period established patterns of behavior and institutional structures that would define Thayan development for centuries to come. The emphasis on adaptability over rigid adherence to traditional methods, the willingness to experiment with new approaches to old problems, and the recognition that sustainable power required more than simple magical superiority. All of these lessons would influence Red Wizard, thinking long after the cosmic crisis that had taught them had passed into history. Yet the fundamental moral corruption that had characterized Thayan society since its earliest days remained unchanged, despite the strategic innovations that emerged from this period of crisis and adaptation. The Red Wizards continued to view other human beings as resources to be exploited rather than individuals deserving of respect and consideration, while their approach to international relations remained fundamentally predatory despite its increased sophistication. The legacy of the Time of Troubles period would ultimately prove to be the foundation for Thay's transformation from isolated magical kingdom to major regional power with global reach. The economic and diplomatic innovations that necessity had forced them to develop would eventually provide the tools for achieving the world domination that military conquest had failed to accomplish, but at costs that would continue to mount over the centuries that followed. The emergence of Szass Tam as the dominant force in Thayan politics was not the sudden ascension of an ambitious upstart, but rather the culmination of a centuries-long campaign of patient manipulation, strategic alliance building, and ruthless elimination of rivals that demonstrated both the sophistication of his planning and the profound corruption of his character. Born into a minor noble family in the city of Thaymount during the early decades of the 14th century, the future Lich King displayed from his earliest years the combination of intellectual brilliance and moral flexibility that would eventually elevate him to absolute power over one of Faerun's most feared magical civilizations. The circumstances of Szass Tam's birth and early childhood remained shrouded in deliberate mystery, as the future Zulkir took great care throughout his rise to power to eliminate records and witnesses that might provide insight into his origins or reveal vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. What is known comes primarily from fragmentary accounts preserved in the private journals of Red Wizards who observed his early career, supplemented by intelligence reports compiled by foreign powers who recognized his potential threat long before his fellow Thayans understood the scope of his ambitions. The magical talent that would define Szass Tam's entire existence manifested during his 7th year, when a childhood tantrum resulted in the spontaneous animation of several deceased household pets that had been buried in the family garden. The incident might have been dismissed as an anomalous magical surge were it not for the fact that the animated creatures remained active for several days, following simple commands and displaying behavior that suggested their animation was more sophisticated than typical necromantic accidents. The family's decision to conceal this incident from local authorities reflected both their understanding of necromancy's controversial status within Thayan society and their recognition that their son's abilities might provide opportunities for social advancement if properly developed. The private tutors who were engaged to provide his early magical education were chosen as much for their discretion as for their knowledge, while the curriculum they developed emphasized not only necromantic technique, but also the political skills necessary for survival in a society where magical ability determined social status. The young Szass Tam's progression through the preliminary stages of magical education was marked by a precocious understanding of power dynamics that set him apart from his contemporaries even more than his exceptional necromantic abilities. Where other students focused primarily on mastering specific spells or techniques, he devoted equal attention to studying the relationships between different magical schools, the personal rivalries that divided the Red Wizard hierarchy, and the economic factors that influenced political decision-making within the ruling council. His admission to the prestigious Academy of Necromantic Arts in El Taba represented both a recognition of his exceptional abilities and the beginning of a transformation that would gradually erode whatever moral constraints had previously limited his pursuit of power. The Academy's environment, where students were explicitly encouraged to compete against each other through any means necessary, provided the perfect laboratory for developing the ruthless pragmatism that would characterize his approach to all future challenges. The research projects that Szass Tam pursued during his years at the Academy revealed an early fascination with the theoretical foundations of undeath that went far beyond the practical applications that satisfied most of his fellow students. His thesis on the relationship between soul energy and necromantic animation was considered groundbreaking by his instructors, not only for its technical sophistication, but for its implications regarding the possibility of achieving true immortality through magical means. The experiments that supported this theoretical work required test subjects that the Academy's official policies would not have permitted, a limitation that Szass Tam circumvented through arrangements with slave traders who were willing to provide expendable subjects in exchange for magical services. These early forays into morally questionable research practices established patterns of behavior that would escalate throughout his career, as each successful experiment demonstrated that ethical constraints were merely obstacles to be overcome rather than principles to be respected. The graduation ceremony that marked his transition from student to full practitioner was notable not only for the exceptional quality of his magical demonstrations, but for the mysterious disappearance of several rival students whose BAM research had competed with his own for academic recognition. The official investigation into these disappearances was cursory at best, reflecting both the Academy's reluctance to examine too closely the methods employed by its most promising graduates and the political influence that Szass Tam had already begun to cultivate among the institution's faculty. The early years of his professional career were characterized by a careful balance between visible achievement and covert manipulation, as he recognized that premature displays of ambition might provoke responses from established powers within the necromantic hierarchy that he was not yet prepared to counter. His public reputation during this period was that of a dedicated researcher whose innovations in necromantic theory promised to advance the entire school's understanding of undeath, while his private activities involved the systematic cultivation of allies, the collection of compromising information about potential enemies, and the gradual accumulation of resources necessary for more ambitious future projects. The establishment of his first private laboratory marked a crucial milestone in Szass Tam's development, providing him with the facilities necessary for experiments that would have been impossible within the Academy's supervised environment. The location he selected, in a series of natural caves beneath the Thayan region, offered both the isolation required for sensitive research and the symbolic connection to death and burial that reinforced his identification with necromantic principles. The research conducted in this hidden facility pushed the boundaries of necromantic knowledge in directions that would have horrified even the morally flexible scholars of the Red Wizard establishment. The systematic study of soul manipulation, the development of techniques for preserving consciousness within undead forms, and the exploration of methods for transferring life force between different beings all represented innovations that advanced magical understanding while simultaneously demonstrating the complete absence of ethical constraints that had come to characterize Szass Tam's approach to scholarly inquiry. The first successful experiment in consciousness preservation occurred during his 40th year, when he managed to transfer the awareness of a dying slave into the animated corpse of another victim while maintaining sufficient cognitive function to permit complex communication and reasoning. The implications of this achievement extended far beyond its immediate necromantic applications, as it demonstrated the theoretical possibility of preserving one's own consciousness within an undead form that would be immune to the natural processes of aging and disease. The political applications of his growing necromantic expertise began to manifest during the same period, as other red wizards recognized that his research might provide solutions to problems that had long plagued their civilization. The chronic shortage of reliable labor that affected all Thayan industries could potentially be addressed through the systematic animation of deceased workers, while the military applications of undead soldiers promised to revolutionize the nation's approach to territorial expansion and defense. The alliances that Szass Tam formed during this period were based primarily on mutual advantage rather than genuine friendship or shared ideology, reflecting his understanding that political relationships were tools to be employed rather than bonds to be cherished. His willingness to share certain aspects of his research with selected colleagues provided him with valuable allies within the necromantic hierarchy, while simultaneously creating dependencies that could be exploited when circumstances required changes in political alignment. The gradual expansion of his influence within the school of necromancy was facilitated by the systematic elimination of rivals through methods that were sophisticated enough to avoid detection while being obvious enough to serve as warnings to potential future opponents. The deaths that marked his ascent through the hierarchy appeared to be the result of magical accidents, research mishaps, or simple bad luck. But their timing and circumstances suggested a pattern that was recognized by perceptive observers even when it could not be definitively proven. The transformation ritual that converted Szass Tam from living wizard to undead lich represented the culmination of decades of theoretical research and practical experimentation. But it also marked the beginning of a fundamentally different phase of his existence that would be characterized by perspectives and priorities that no living being could fully comprehend. The process itself, conducted in absolute secrecy within the deepest chambers of his hidden laboratory, required preparations that had consumed years of effort and resources that would have bankrupted most other practitioners. The phylactery that would house his soul during the transformation was crafted from materials acquired through transactions that had required the cooperation of extraplanar entities whose assistance came at prices that would have horrified even seasoned red wizards. The obsidian sphere, carved with symbols that predated human civilization, and inlaid with precious metals that had been alchemically treated to resonate with necromantic energies, represented both a masterwork of magical craftsmanship and a testament to the depths of moral compromise that Szass Tam was willing to accept in pursuit of his goals. The moment of transformation itself was experienced as both death and rebirth, as his living consciousness was torn from its mortal housing and reconstituted within the undead form that would serve as his vehicle for immortal existence. The pain that accompanied this process was beyond description, but it was accompanied by a sense of liberation from the limitations and vulnerabilities that had previously constrained his actions and ambitions. The first weeks of his undead existence were marked by a period of adjustment as he learned to function within a body that no longer required food, sleep, or other biological necessities that had previously structured his daily routine. The enhanced mental clarity that accompanied his transformation allowed him to perceive patterns and possibilities that had been obscured by the distractions of mortal existence, while the immunity to fatigue enabled him to pursue projects with an intensity and duration that would have been impossible for living researchers. The revelation of his transformation to the broader necromantic community was managed with the same careful planning that had characterized every other aspect of his rise to power. Rather than making dramatic announcements that might have provoked immediate challenges to his authority, he allowed knowledge of his changed status to circulate gradually through networks of allies and informants who could shape perceptions and manage reactions according to his strategic objectives. The responses of his fellow red wizards to the news of his lichdom revealed the complex mixture of fear, respect, and opportunism that would define their relationships with him for the remainder of his reign. Those who had previously viewed him as a talented but ultimately mortal rival were forced to recalculate their strategies in light of his transformation, while others saw his achievement as validation of necromantic superiority that might provide opportunities for their own advancement. The political maneuvering that followed his transformation was complex and multifaceted, as various factions within the Red Wizard hierarchy attempted to position themselves advantageously relative to this new and unprecedented form of leadership. The traditional mechanisms for challenging or replacing Zolkirs were largely irrelevant when dealing with an immortal opponent whose power base included not only political allies but also growing numbers of undead servants whose loyalty was absolute and permanent. The first major policy initiatives that Szass Tam implemented following his transformation revealed the extent to which his perspectives had been altered by his undead status. The living concerns that had previously influenced his decision-making, personal comfort, social relationships, even basic survival, were replaced by longer-term considerations that reflected his immortal nature and his growing disconnection from mortal humanity. The expansion of necromantic research programs throughout Thay was justified as necessary for maintaining the nation's competitive advantage in an increasingly dangerous world, but the scale and scope of these initiatives suggested ambitions that went far beyond simple national defense. The resources allocated to these programs diverted funds from other priorities, while the recruitment of research subjects created social disruptions that affected communities throughout the realm. The establishment of the Doom Vault represented perhaps the most significant monument to Szass Tam's vision during this early period of his undead reign. This massive underground complex, carved into the living rock beneath the Thaymount peaks, was designed to serve simultaneously as research facility, military headquarters, and secure repository for the most dangerous artifacts and experiments that necromantic science could produce. The construction of this facility required engineering techniques that pushed the boundaries of both magical and mundane technology, while the labor force employed in its creation was deliberately chosen from populations whose disappearance would create minimal social disruption. The thousands of workers who participated in the Doom Vault's construction were systematically eliminated upon its completion, ensuring that its secrets would remain protected while also providing raw materials for the undead guardians that would protect it from future intruders. The research programs conducted within the Doom Vault during its early years of operation focused primarily on developing improved techniques for creating and controlling undead creatures. But the scope of investigation gradually expanded to include broader questions about the nature of death, consciousness, and the fundamental forces that governed existence itself. The experiments conducted in its deepest chambers pushed ethical boundaries that had never been tested, while the discoveries that emerged from this work provided knowledge that would influence magical theory throughout the known worlds. The gradual transformation of Thayan society under Szass Tam's influence was initially subtle enough to avoid provoking organized resistance, but the cumulative effect of his policies created changes that fundamentally altered the character of the nation and its people. The increased emphasis on necromantic research and undead labor created economic dependencies that made traditional forms of work obsolete, while the growing presence of undead creatures in daily life normalized relationships with death that would have seemed abhorrent to previous generations. The psychological impact of living in a society increasingly dominated by undead influences was profound but difficult to quantify, as the changes occurred gradually enough that most citizens adapted without fully recognizing the extent of their transformation. The casual acceptance of practices that had once been considered morally questionable, the growing indifference to suffering that did not directly affect one's own interests, and the increasing tendency to view other living beings as potential resources rather than fellow creatures. All of these changes reflected the corruption of values that accompanied Szass Tam's ascendancy. The international reactions to Szass Tam's transformation and its implications for regional stability revealed the extent to which Thay's neighbors had come to depend upon predictable patterns of behavior from the Red Wizard state. The prospect of dealing with an immortal ruler whose perspectives were fundamentally alien to mortal concerns, created diplomatic challenges that traditional statecraft was ill-equipped to address. While the military implications of his necromantic innovations forced neighboring powers to reconsider their defense strategies, the economic opportunities that Szass Tam's innovations created for international trade partners created moral dilemmas that would persist for decades, as foreign merchants found themselves profiting from commerce that was increasingly dependent upon the systematic exploitation of undead labor. The magical goods that Thayan workshops produced using these methods were superior in quality and lower in cost than anything available from conventional sources, but their acquisition required willful blindness to the methods employed in their creation. The long-term vision that began to emerge from Szass Tam's policies during this period suggested ambitions that extended far beyond simple national aggrandizement to encompass fundamental changes in the nature of civilization itself. The systematic replacement of living labor with undead workers, the gradual elimination of traditional social structures based on mortal concerns, and the development of magical techniques that could extend necromantic influence across vast distances all pointed toward a future in which death itself might become merely another form of political control. The resistance movements that began to organize in response to these developments faced challenges that were unprecedented in the history of political opposition. As traditional methods of rebellion were largely ineffective against a ruler who could not be assassinated, bribed, or intimidated through conventional means, the networks of dissent that formed during this period were forced to develop new strategies and tactics that acknowledged the unique nature of their opponent while seeking vulnerabilities that could be exploited despite his apparent invincibility. The consolidation of power that Szass Tam achieved during this crucial period of his reign established foundations that would support his authority for centuries to come, creating institutional structures and cultural patterns that were specifically designed to perpetuate undead rule, even in the face of organized opposition or external pressure. The transformation of Thay from a nation ruled by an undead leader into a civilization fundamentally shaped by undead principles would prove to be his most lasting and significant achievement, surpassing even his personal attainment of lichdom in its impact on the broader course of regional history. The civil war that would tear Thay apart for nearly a decade began not with dramatic declarations or battlefield confrontations, but with a series of seemingly minor policy disputes that gradually revealed the irreconcilable philosophical differences separating Szass Tam from his fellow Zulkars. The immortal necromancer's vision of a realm governed entirely according to undead principles came into increasingly sharp conflict with the perspectives of living red wizards who, however corrupt and power-hungry they might be, retained enough connection to mortal concerns to recognize the existential threat that his policies represented to their own survival and relevance. The initial catalyst for open conflict emerged from what appeared to be a routine administrative decision regarding the allocation of resources for magical research. Szass Tam's proposal to redirect funds from traditional spell research toward expanded necromantic programs was presented to the Council of Zulkirs as a matter of practical efficiency, emphasizing the superior cost-effectiveness of undead labor and the strategic advantages that necromantic innovations could provide in future military campaigns. The surface rationality of these arguments concealed deeper implications that his colleagues were only beginning to understand. The Zulkir of Evocation, Nevron, was among the first to recognize that Szass Tam's seemingly reasonable proposals were part of a comprehensive strategy to marginalize all non-necromantic schools of magic within Thayan society. His objections during the crucial council session were phrased in terms of academic balance and scholarly diversity, but they reflected a growing awareness that the Lich's ultimate goal was the complete transformation of their civilization into something that would have no place for living wizards, regardless of their magical specialization or political utility. The debate that followed Nevron's intervention revealed fault lines within the Red Wizard hierarchy that had been developing for decades but had remained largely hidden beneath the surface of collegial cooperation. The younger Zulkirs, many of whom had risen to prominence during the period of Szass Tam's ascendancy, were more inclined to accept his leadership and adapt their own practices to complement his necromantic vision. The older members of the council, however, retained memories of a time when the schools of magic had operated as genuinely independent entities, and they viewed his proposals as unacceptable encroachments upon their traditional autonomy. The Zulkir of Enchantment, Lozeril, attempted to broker a compromise that would preserve the appearance of unity while addressing the underlying concerns that were dividing the council. His suggestion that necromantic research be expanded without corresponding reductions in funding for other schools seemed to offer a solution that could satisfy all parties, but it failed to address the fundamental question of whether Thay's future would be shaped by mortal or undead priorities. Szass Tam's response to these diplomatic overtures revealed both his growing impatience with the constraints imposed by collective decision-making and his confidence that his position had become strong enough to survive open confrontation with his colleagues. Rather than accepting the offered compromise, he demanded not only increased resources for necromantic research, but also formal recognition of necromancy's preeminence among the magical schools and explicit acknowledgement of his own authority to override council decisions when they conflicted with what he deemed to be the nation's long-term interests. The stunned silence that greeted this demand was broken by Zulkir Tharkion Pyrrhus of the School of Transmutation, whose outraged rejection of Szass Tam's proposal was supported by immediate and vocal agreement from most of the other council members. The confrontation that followed was the first time in decades that the collegial facade of Red Wizard politics had been openly abandoned in favor of direct threats and ultimatums, marking the point of no return beyond which peaceful resolution of their differences became impossible. The military preparations that began immediately following this breakdown in negotiations revealed the extent to which both sides had been quietly positioning themselves for potential conflict, even while maintaining public appearances of Don-self. Unity. Szass Tam's undead forces had been steadily expanded and positioned throughout the realm under the guise of routine security measures, while his opponents had been cultivating alliances with conventional military units whose commanders retained enough independence to resist necromantic influence. The first actual violence occurred not in a planned battle between organized armies, but in a series of simultaneous assassinations and magical duels that eliminated key supporters of both factions within the span of a single night. The precision and coordination required for these strikes demonstrated that both sides possessed intelligence networks and strike capabilities that had been developed in secret over extended periods. While the casualties suffered in these opening moves included some of the most accomplished wizards in Thayan history, the attempt on Szass Tam's own existence during this night of blood represented perhaps the most sophisticated magical assassination plot ever devised, involving the coordinated efforts of multiple Zulkirs whose specialties were combined to create an attack that could theoretically have destroyed even a lich of his power. The failure of this attempt, due to precautions that suggested he had anticipated such an assault, eliminated any possibility of resolving the conflict through the simple expedient of removing its primary instigator. The escape of Szass Tam from what should have been a certain destruction became the stuff of legend among Thayan chroniclers, though the details of exactly how he survived remained a closely guarded secret that would fuel speculation for decades to come. Some accounts suggested that he had employed previously unknown necromantic techniques to transfer his consciousness into backup phylacteries hidden throughout the realm, while others claimed that he had forged alliances with extraplanar entities whose intervention at the crucial moment had preserved his existence in exchange for future considerations. The revelation of his survival reached his enemies at the same time as news of devastating attacks upon their own strongholds and support networks. As the Lich demonstrated that his apparent vulnerability during the assassination attempt had been a carefully orchestrated deception designed to lure his opponents into revealing their full capabilities and commitment. The counterstrike that followed was more devastating than anything his enemies had imagined possible, involving coordinated assaults by undead forces that had been secretly positioned near every major center of opposition. The siege of Pyrrhados, the stronghold of Zulkir Pyrrhus, became the first major military engagement of the civil war and established patterns that would characterize the entire conflict. The attacking undead forces demonstrated capabilities that went far beyond simple reanimation, employing sophisticated tactics and magical enhancements that reflected decades of careful development under Szass Tam's direction. The defenders, despite their formidable magical abilities and well-prepared fortifications, found themselves facing enemies that were immune to many conventional offensive spells while possessing supernatural endurance that allowed them to maintain siege conditions indefinitely. The breakthrough that finally allowed the undead forces to penetrate Pyrrhados came through the treachery of several red wizards within the garrison who had been secretly converted to Szass Tam's cause through means that combined magical compulsion with calculated appeals to their personal ambitions. The revelation that the Lich had been infiltrating his enemies' organizations for years, potentially decades, created a crisis of trust among the opposition forces that would plague their efforts throughout the remainder of the conflict. The fall of Pyrrhados and the gruesome fate that befell its defenders served notice that this would not be a conventional political struggle resolved through negotiation or limited warfare, but an existential conflict in which surrender would mean not merely political defeat, but transformation into the very undead creatures that the living Zulkirs were fighting to resist. The public display of Zulkir Pyrrhus, transformed into a zombie compelled to serve his former enemy, sent shockwaves throughout Thayan society while demonstrating the kinds of fates that awaited those who continued to oppose the Lich's vision. The international ramifications of the Thayan civil war created opportunities and dangers for neighboring powers who had long sought to limit Red Wizard influence in regional affairs. The temporary weakness created by internal conflict offered tempting possibilities for territorial gains or commercial advantages, but the prospect of either faction achieving decisive victory raised concerns about the long-term implications of dealing with a unified Thay under either conventional or undead leadership. Aglaron's decision to provide covert support to Szass Tam's opponents reflected calculations that a weakened Thay divided against itself was preferable to a strengthened realm under undead rule. But this assistance came with risks that would prove difficult to manage as the conflict escalated. The magical weapons and intelligence information that flowed across the border helped sustain resistance to the Lich's forces, but they also created commitments that would require continued involvement even when circumstances made such support increasingly dangerous. The entry of foreign mercenaries into the conflict marked a significant escalation that transformed what had begun as an internal Thayan dispute into a broader regional crisis with implications that extended far beyond the original. Participants. The gold that both factions offered for military assistance attracted adventurers, sellswords, and opportunistic wizards from throughout the Eastern realms, while the magical resources that were deployed in their recruitment created dependencies and obligations that would influence regional politics for generations. The Battle of the Smoking Crown, fought on the slopes of the Thaymount Peaks where the conflict had begun, represented the climactic engagement of the entire war and demonstrated both the devastating potential of unrestricted magical warfare and the ultimate futility of conventional tactics against an opponent whose resources were essentially unlimited. The coalition forces that Szass Tam's enemies had assembled for this decisive confrontation represented the largest army ever fielded against the Lich, including contingents from multiple foreign powers, elite units from every school of magic, and mercenary formations whose combined experience encompassed conflicts throughout the known world. The magical bombardment that preceded the main assault was visible from distances of hundreds of miles, as the concentrated spellcasting of dozens of powerful wizards created effects that temporarily altered local weather patterns and left permanent scars upon the landscape that would remain visible for centuries. The coordination required to maintain such devastating attacks while avoiding interference between different magical effects represented a pinnacle of military spellcasting that had never before been achieved in the history of organized warfare. Yet for all their preparation and numerical superiority, the coalition forces found themselves facing enemies whose advantages went beyond simple military capability to encompass fundamental differences in the nature of existence itself. The undead creatures that formed the core of Szass Tam's army were immune to many of the psychological effects that broke the morale of living soldiers, while their lack of biological needs allowed them to fight with an endurance that no mortal force could match. The turning point of the battle came when Szass Tam himself entered the fray, revealing magical capabilities that had been enhanced by his undead nature to levels that exceeded anything his enemies had anticipated. The necromantic techniques that he deployed during this engagement drew upon power sources that living wizards could not access, while the tactical coordination he achieved with his undead forces demonstrated a unity of command that no conventional army could replicate. The systematic destruction of the coalition's leadership through targeted magical assassinations eliminated the command structure that had been necessary to coordinate their complex battle plans, while the reanimation of fallen enemies as reinforcements for his own forces created a feedback loop that gradually shifted the numerical balance in favor of the undead army. The psychological impact of watching former comrades rise as enemies was devastating to the morale of surviving coalition troops, many of whom began to question whether victory was possible against an opponent who could turn their own dead against them. The retreat that followed the collapse of organized resistance became a rout that scattered the surviving opposition forces across the breadth of Thay and beyond its borders. The casualties suffered during this phase of the battle were proportionally higher than those sustained during the actual fighting, as fleeing soldiers found themselves pursued by undead creatures whose supernatural stamina allowed them to maintain the chase far longer than any living pursuer could manage. The aftermath of the Battle of the Smoking Crown established Szass Tam's dominance over Thay beyond any reasonable challenge, but the process of consolidating this victory required years of systematic elimination of remaining pockets of resistance and the careful reconstruction of governmental institutions according to undead principles. The loyal Zulkirs who had supported his cause were rewarded with expanded authority and resources, while the positions previously held by his enemies were either eliminated entirely or filled with creatures whose loyalty was guaranteed through necromantic compulsion. The transformation of Thayan's society that followed the civil war's conclusion was more profound than even Szass Tam's most dedicated supporters had anticipated, as the Lich implemented policies that systematically eliminated the distinction between living and undead citizens in favor of a hierarchical system based entirely upon magical capability and personal loyalty to the ruling authority. The cultural changes that accompanied this political transformation would influence every aspect of daily life within the realm, creating a civilization that was unlike anything that had previously existed in the known world. The international isolation that resulted from these internal changes forced Thay to develop new approaches to diplomacy and trade that acknowledged the reality that most foreign powers were fundamentally uncomfortable with conducting normal relations with an undead-ruled state. The innovative solutions that emerged from this challenge would ultimately provide the foundation for Thay's later success in extending its influence throughout the region. But they required immediate adaptations that tested the flexibility and creativity of even the most experienced Red Wizard administrators. The establishment of the new order under Szass Tam's absolute authority represented both the culmination of his centuries-long campaign for power and the beginning of a fundamentally different phase in Thayan history that would be characterized by unprecedented stability, remarkable innovation, and moral corruption so complete that it challenged the basic assumptions about civilization and progress that had guided political development throughout the region. The victory that he had achieved through superior planning, magical capability, and ruthless determination had created possibilities for future development that were both inspiring and terrifying in their implications for the broader world. The cataclysm that struck Faerun in 1385 brought changes so profound that the very nature of magic itself was transformed. Yet for Szass Tam and his undead realm, the Spellplague represented not disaster but opportunity on a scale that even his immortal perspective had not previously imagined. Where other magical civilizations found themselves crippled by the sudden unreliability of spells that had functioned according to predictable principles for millennia, Thay discovered that its necromantic foundations provided a degree of stability that allowed not merely survival but unprecedented expansion into realms of power that had previously been beyond mortal reach. The first manifestations of the Spellplague within Thayan borders revealed the extent to which Szass Tam's decades of preparation had positioned his realm to weather magical disruptions that devastated less prescient civilizations. The undead creatures that formed the backbone of Thayan society were largely unaffected by the chaotic magical energies that were wreaking havoc throughout the rest of Faerun, while the necromantic techniques that sustained them proved remarkably resistant to the reality-warping effects that were disrupting other schools of magic. The initial reports that reached the Doom Vault from agents stationed throughout the known world painted a picture of magical chaos that was both horrifying and exhilarating in its implications for Thayan expansion. Ancient magical kingdoms were collapsing as their fundamental spells failed without warning. Powerful wizards were being consumed by their own magic as familiar techniques produced wildly unpredictable results. And the entire infrastructure of magical civilization was crumbling under the assault of forces that defied comprehension. Szass Tam's response to this crisis demonstrated both the strategic acumen that had elevated him to absolute power and the moral flexibility that characterized all his major decisions. Rather than attempting to provide assistance to suffering neighboring realms or seeking to understand the cosmic forces that were reshaping reality, he immediately recognized the Spellplague as an unprecedented opportunity to advance Thayan interests, while potential competitors were too weakened to offer effective resistance. The emergency council sessions that convened in the deepest chambers of the Doom Vault brought together the most powerful necromancers in Szass Tam's service to evaluate the crisis and develop strategies for exploiting the opportunities it presented. The discussions that followed revealed both the sophistication of Thayan magical theory and the complete absence of ethical constraints that might have limited their response to the suffering occurring throughout the region. The research programs that were immediately initiated to study the Spellplague's effects on necromantic magic produced discoveries that would transform Thayan society even more profoundly than Szass Tam's original ascension to lichdom. The chaotic magical energies that were disrupting other forms of spellcasting were found to enhance certain necromantic techniques while opening entirely new avenues for magical development that had been previously impossible or prohibitively dangerous. The connection between the material plane and the Shadowfell, that realm of death and negative energy that had always been necromancy's most important extraplanar source of power, was dramatically strengthened by the Spellplague's reality-warping effects. The barriers that had traditionally separated these planes became permeable in ways that allowed unprecedented access to shadow-based magical techniques, while also enabling the transportation of resources and creatures between dimensions on a scale that dwarfed anything previously achieved. The establishment of permanent gates linking Thayan territory to strategic locations within the Shadowfell represented perhaps the most significant magical engineering project in the realm's history, requiring coordination between dozens of the most powerful necromancers in Szass Tam's service while consuming resources that would have bankrupted most other civilizations. The technical challenges involved in creating stable, interdimensional passages during a period when magical reality itself was in flux tested the limits of Thayan expertise while providing invaluable experience in manipulating the chaotic energies that the Spellplague had unleashed. The shadow magic techniques that emerged from this expanded access to the Shadowfell represented innovations that went far beyond simple improvements to existing necromantic spells. The ability to manipulate darkness as a tangible substance, to travel instantaneously between shadowed locations across vast distances, and to drain life force from enemies while simultaneously strengthening undead allies opened tactical and strategic possibilities that would have been pure fantasy only years earlier. The military applications of these shadow-based innovations were immediately apparent to Szass Tam and his advisors, who recognized that Thayan forces equipped with such capabilities would possess decisive advantages over any conventional enemies they might encounter. The undead armies that had already demonstrated their superiority during the Civil War were enhanced with shadow magic abilities that made them even more formidable, while opening new possibilities for covert operations and intelligence gathering. The economic implications of the Spellplague were equally significant for Thayan development, as the collapse of competing magical civilizations created market opportunities that could be exploited by an organization with the resources and stability to maintain production during periods of widespread chaos. The magical items that Thayan workshops had been producing for domestic use and limited export suddenly became precious commodities that desperate customers throughout Faerun would pay almost any price to acquire. The transformation of Thay from primarily military power to major commercial empire began during this period, as Szass Tam recognized that economic influence could achieve results that military conquest alone could never accomplish. The expansion of magical item production required significant investments in infrastructure and personnel, but the profits generated by sales to customers whose own magical capabilities had been compromised by the Spellplague more than justified these expenditures. The establishment of the first permanent Thayan enclaves outside the realm's traditional borders represented a strategic innovation that would define the nation's international relations for decades to come. Rather than attempting to govern conquered territories directly, which had proven problematic during previous expansion attempts, the Red Wizards began negotiating agreements with foreign powers that allowed them to establish fortified commercial outposts that could serve multiple functions simultaneously. These enclaves operated under legal frameworks that granted them significant autonomy within their host territories while providing the diplomatic immunity necessary for Thayan agents to conduct sensitive operations without interference from local authorities. The negotiations required to establish such arrangements were complex and often lengthy, but the results provided Thay with intelligence-gathering capabilities and economic opportunities that far exceeded anything that simple military occupation could have achieved. The magical goods that flowed from these enclaves to customers throughout the chaos-stricken regions of Faerun included items that would have been considered impossibly powerful or prohibitively expensive under normal circumstances. The desperate need for reliable magical equipment during a period when traditional sources had become unreliable created market conditions that allowed Thayan merchants to charge premium prices while simultaneously building relationships with customers who would become dependent upon continued access to their products. The addiction-inducing properties that were deliberately incorporated into certain categories of magical items represented perhaps the most morally questionable aspect of Thayan commercial strategy during this period. The techniques for creating magical dependencies that ensured repeat customers were developed through research programs that treated foreign consumers as unwitting test subjects in experiments designed to maximize long-term profitability regardless of the human cost involved. The Ziran compound that became synonymous with Thayan magical addiction was engineered to provide genuine benefits that justified its initial use, while creating physiological and psychological dependencies that made discontinuation increasingly difficult. The customers who began using Ziran-enhanced magical items for their obvious practical advantages found themselves experiencing withdrawal symptoms when they attempted to switch to alternative products. While the cumulative effects of long-term exposure included personality changes that made users more receptive to Thayan influence. The distribution networks that supported this commercial expansion required sophisticated logistics capabilities that drew upon both conventional trading relationships and the shadow magic innovations that had emerged from Spellplague. Research. The ability to transport goods instantaneously between shadowed locations allowed Thayan merchants to maintain supply lines that were immune to conventional interdiction, while providing response times that no competitor could match. The intelligence value of these commercial relationships extended far beyond simple economic benefits, as Thayan agents embedded within the Enclave system provided detailed reports on political developments, military capabilities, and social conditions throughout the regions where they operated. The information gathered through these networks allowed Szass Tam to monitor potential threats and opportunities with a precision that would have been impossible through conventional diplomatic channels. The cultural influence that accompanied Thayan commercial expansion was perhaps more significant than its immediate economic impact, as foreign customers gradually became accustomed to accepting products and services that would have been considered morally unacceptable under normal circumstances. The normalization of slavery-produced goods, the casual acceptance of necromantic enhancement techniques, and the gradual erosion of ethical constraints regarding magical experimentation all reflected the subtle ways that Thayan values were being exported along with Thayan products. The diplomatic immunities that protected Thayan enclaves from local interference also created safe havens for activities that would have been illegal under the laws of their host territories. The slave markets that operated within these protected compounds provided convenient access to human resources for customers who preferred not to acknowledge the moral implications of their purchases, while the magical services offered by Thayan practitioners included procedures that violated both legal and ethical standards in most civilized regions. The international responses to Thayan commercial expansion revealed the extent to which the Spellplague had weakened the moral resolve of even traditionally ethical powers. Rulers who had previously condemned Red Wizard practices found themselves quietly negotiating for access to magical goods that their own territories could no longer produce, while religious leaders who had once preached against the evils of undeath discovered practical reasons to overlook the origins of helpful magical assistance. The corruption of foreign officials through carefully targeted bribes of magical items and services created networks of influence that extended Thayan reach far beyond the physical boundaries of their enclaves. Local administrators who accepted Thayan gifts found themselves gradually compromised by dependencies and obligations that made resistance to future requests increasingly difficult, while the magical enhancements that accompanied these relationships provided benefits that justified continued cooperation. The Shadow Realm territories that Thay established during this period represented perhaps the most ambitious expansion project in the realm's history, as entire regions within the Shadowfell were claimed and developed according to Thayan principles. These shadowy colonies provided access to resources that were unavailable on the material plane while offering strategic positions that could be used to project power throughout the interconnected network of planes and dimensions. The cities that were constructed within these shadow territories reflected architectural principles that combined traditional Thayan design with innovations made possible by the unique properties of the Shadowfell environment. The buildings that rose from the shadowy landscape were both magnificent and disturbing, incorporating living darkness as a construction material, while providing accommodations that could house both living and undead residents in equal comfort. The populations that inhabited these shadow colonies included not only Thayan expatriates and their undead servants, but also creatures native to the Shadowfell who had been recruited or coerced into serving Red Wizard interests. The cultural synthesis that emerged from these interactions created new forms of society that were unlike anything that had previously existed. While the magical innovations that resulted from this cultural mixing advanced necromantic theory in directions that would have been impossible without access to Shadow Realm expertise, the temporal distortions that affected certain regions of the Shadowfell provided Thayan researchers with opportunities to accelerate magical experimentation while minimizing the risks associated with dangerous procedures. The ability to conduct centuries of research within time-dilated environments while only days or weeks passed on the material plane allowed for the development of techniques and discoveries that would have required generations under normal circumstances. The increasing isolation from conventional morality that characterized Szass Tam's reign during this period was both a cause and consequence of Thay's growing success in exploiting the opportunities created by the Spellplague. The psychological effects of prolonged existence within environments dominated by death and shadow gradually eroded whatever remnants of empathy or ethical constraint had previously influenced Red Wizard decision-making. While the practical benefits of abandoning moral limitations provided immediate justifications for continued moral deterioration, the transformation of Thayan society into something that was fundamentally alien to normal human experience was completed during this era. As the distinction between living and undead citizens became increasingly irrelevant compared to considerations of magical ability and loyalty to the ruling authority, the cultural changes that accompanied this transformation created a civilization that was uniquely suited to exploiting the chaotic conditions that the Spellplague had created throughout the known world, while establishing patterns of development that would influence regional history for generations to come. The legacy of the Spellplague period in Thayan history would ultimately prove to be the foundation for the realm's emergence as the dominant magical power in Eastern Faerun, providing both the resources and the techniques necessary for achieving the kind of influence that military conquest alone could never have accomplished. The adaptations that necessity had forced during this period of cosmic chaos created capabilities and relationships that would serve Thayan interests long after the immediate crisis had passed, while establishing precedents for future expansion that would shape the realm's development for centuries to come. The transformation of Thay from a militaristic magical kingdom into a sprawling commercial empire represented perhaps the most sophisticated evolution in political strategy that the known world had ever witnessed. As Szass Tam and his undead administrators recognized that economic influence could achieve conquests that armies could never accomplish while avoiding the costs and risks associated with traditional territorial expansion. The network of enclaves that emerged during the decades following the Spellplague created a web of commercial relationships that gradually transformed Thay from isolated pariah state into an indispensable partner whose magical goods and services had become essential to the functioning of civilizations throughout Faerun. The economic principles that guided this transformation were based upon careful analysis of the dependencies and vulnerabilities that the Spellplague had created in foreign markets, combined with ruthless exploitation of Thay's unique advantages in magical production and distribution. The undead labor force that had initially been developed for military purposes proved ideally suited for manufacturing operations that required precise timing, dangerous working conditions, and continuous production schedules that would have been impossible to maintain using conventional workers. The workshops that were established throughout Thayan territory during this period represented marvels of magical engineering that combined traditional craftsmanship techniques with necromantic innovations that allowed unprecedented control over every aspect of the production process. The zombie artisans who formed the backbone of these operations possessed skills that had been preserved from their living existences while gaining supernatural endurance and precision that no mortal craftsman could match, creating finished products whose quality exceeded anything available from competing sources. The magical items that emerged from these workshops were designed according to specifications that balanced genuine utility with carefully engineered dependencies that ensured long-term customer relationships. The enhancement potions that became synonymous with Thayan commercial success provided immediate benefits that justified their premium prices while incorporating addictive compounds that made discontinuation increasingly difficult as usage patterns became established over time. The distribution networks that supported this commercial expansion required logistics capabilities that drew upon both conventional trading relationships and the shadow magic innovations that had emerged from Spellplague research. The ability to transport goods instantaneously between predetermined locations allowed Thayan merchants to maintain supply lines that were immune to conventional interdiction, while providing response times that consistently outperformed any competitor's capabilities. The Enclave system that served as the foundation for Thayan commercial operations was based upon diplomatic agreements that granted significant autonomy to Red Wizard representatives while providing their host territories with access to magical goods and services that were unavailable from any other source. The negotiations required to establish these arrangements were often complex and lengthy, involving careful consideration of local political sensibilities and legal frameworks. But the results provided Thay with unprecedented opportunities for intelligence gathering and influence operations. The legal immunities that protected these enclaves from local interference created environments where Thayan practices that would have been considered illegal or immoral in their host territories could continue without restriction. The slave markets that operated within these protected compounds provided convenient access to human resources for customers who preferred not to acknowledge the moral implications of their purchases. While the magical services offered by Thayan practitioners included procedures that violated both legal and ethical standards in most civilized regions, the cultural transformation that accompanied this commercial expansion was perhaps more significant than its immediate economic impact, as foreign customers gradually became accustomed to accepting products and services that would have been considered morally unacceptable under normal circumstances. The normalization of slavery-produced goods, the casual acceptance of necromantic enhancement techniques, and the gradual erosion of ethical constraints regarding magical experimentation all reflected the subtle ways that Thayan values were being exported along with Thayan products. The addiction-inducing properties that were deliberately incorporated into certain categories of magical items represented the culmination of decades of research into methods for creating long-term customer dependencies that transcended simple commercial relationships. The Ziran compound that became the foundation for this strategy was engineered to provide genuine benefits that justified its initial adoption while creating physiological and psychological dependencies that made alternative products seem inadequate by comparison. The customers who began incorporating Ziran-enhanced magical items into their daily routines found themselves experiencing gradual changes in their decision-making processes that made them increasingly receptive to Thayan suggestions and increasingly resistant to arguments against continued usage. The compound's effects on brain chemistry were subtle enough to avoid detection by conventional, magical, or mundane diagnostic techniques, while the personality changes that accompanied long-term exposure were gradual enough to seem like natural adaptations rather than artificially induced modifications. The intelligence networks that supported these commercial operations provided Szass Tam with detailed information about political developments, military capabilities, and social conditions throughout the regions where Thayan enclaves operated. The agents who gathered this information were able to operate under diplomatic cover while maintaining access to customers whose altered brain chemistry made them unusually willing to share sensitive information with their trusted Thayan. Suppliers. The corruption of foreign officials through carefully targeted gifts of magical items and services created webs of influence that extended Thayan reach far beyond the physical boundaries of their enclaves. Local administrators who accepted Thayan presence found themselves gradually compromised by dependencies and obligations that made resistance to future requests increasingly difficult. While the magical enhancements that accompanied these relationships provided benefits that justified continued cooperation, even when moral concerns might otherwise have intervened. The economic warfare techniques that emerged from this commercial strategy allowed Thay to destabilize potential enemies without resorting to conventional military action. The ability to manipulate supply chains, create artificial shortages of essential goods, and undermine local economies through targeted dumping of subsidized products provided tools for coercion that were both more subtle and more effective than traditional forms of political pressure. The transformation of entire regional economies to depend upon Thayan magical goods created vulnerabilities that could be exploited whenever diplomatic or military pressure was required. The threat of supply interruptions was often sufficient to secure favorable policy changes from governments that had become dependent upon continued access to Thayan products. While the actual implementation of such economic sanctions could bring down regimes that had previously seemed secure in their power, the sophisticated financial instruments that were developed to support this commercial expansion represented innovations in economic theory that would influence trading practices throughout the known world. The credit arrangements that allowed customers to acquire expensive magical items through extended payment plans created debt relationships that provided additional leverage for future negotiations, while the insurance policies that protected against magical mishaps generated steady revenue streams that helped finance further expansion. The banking services that Thayan enclaves began offering during this period filled gaps in the financial infrastructure that the Spellplague had created throughout many regions. The combination of magical security measures and undead personnel who could not be bribed or intimidated made Thayan financial institutions more reliable than many traditional alternatives, while their international networks provided transaction capabilities that smaller regional banks could not match. The magical research and development programs that supported continued product innovation required access to test subjects and experimental conditions that would have been impossible to obtain through legitimate means. The prisoner populations that were acquired through the slave markets provided convenient sources of volunteers for procedures that carried significant risks, while the legal protections that surrounded enclave operations prevented external oversight that might have limited the scope of permissible experimentation. The breakthrough discoveries that emerged from these research programs advanced magical theory while simultaneously creating new product categories that generated substantial profits. The life extension techniques that became available to wealthy customers provided genuine benefits that justified their enormous costs while creating customer relationships that could last for centuries, while the enhancement procedures that improved physical and mental capabilities opened markets among populations that had previously been unable to afford luxury magical services. The environmental consequences of Thayan industrial operations were systematically concealed from foreign customers through magical techniques that displaced pollution and waste products into uninhabited regions or alternative dimensional spaces. The Shadow Realm territories that had been established during the Spellplague period proved particularly useful for disposing of materials that would have created diplomatic complications if their presence in host territories had been discovered. The social engineering programs that accompanied commercial expansion were designed to gradually reshape the cultural values and behavioral patterns of entire populations in ways that made them more receptive to Thayan influence. The educational materials that were distributed through Enclave cultural centers promoted philosophical perspectives that emphasized individual achievement over collective welfare, while subtly undermining traditional sources of moral authority. The religious influence operations that targeted foreign spiritual communities were among the most sophisticated aspects of Thayan cultural manipulation, involving the deliberate spread of theological concepts that made necromantic practices seem more acceptable, while weakening traditional prohibitions against commerce with undead rulers. The scholarly exchanges that brought foreign clerics to study in Thayan libraries exposed them to arguments and evidence that challenged their existing beliefs while providing them with magical enhancements that made return to their previous lifestyles increasingly difficult. The technological innovations that emerged from Thayan workshops during this period represented advances in magical engineering that would not have been possible without the combination of undead labor, shadow realm resources, and accumulated knowledge from centuries of necromantic research. The golem designs that incorporated both mechanical and necromantic principles created servants that were more versatile and reliable than purely magical or purely mechanical alternatives, while the communication systems that linked enclaves across vast distances enabled coordination that gave Thayan operations decisive advantages over their competitors. The military applications of these commercial innovations provided Thay with strategic capabilities that far exceeded what conventional armies could achieve while maintaining the appearance of peaceful commercial activities. The transportation networks that supported trade operations could be rapidly converted to move military personnel and equipment, while the intelligence gathered through commercial relationships provided detailed information about potential targets and their vulnerabilities. The diplomatic influence that Thay achieved through economic relationships often proved more effective than conventional statecraft in securing favorable policies from foreign governments. The rulers who had become dependent upon Thayan magical goods for their personal security and comfort were reluctant to risk disrupting these relationships through policies that might be perceived as hostile, while the economic benefits that Thayan trade brought to their territories created constituencies that actively supported continued cooperation. The transformation of traditional power relationships that resulted from these economic developments created new forms of imperial control that were both more sustainable and more comprehensive than anything that military conquest could have achieved. The voluntary acceptance of Thayan influence by populations that benefited from access to superior magical goods eliminated the resistance that had historically limited the success of foreign occupation forces, while the gradual nature of this transformation made it difficult for potential opponents to identify clear points at which resistance might be organized. The long-term strategic vision that guided these developments anticipated a future in which Thayan influence would extend throughout the civilized world, not through direct political control, but through networks of economic dependency. That would make resistance both impractical and undesirable. The success of this vision depended upon maintaining the technological and magical advantages that made Thayan products indispensable, while gradually expanding the scope of services and goods that foreign customers could not obtain elsewhere. The moral corruption that accompanied this economic success represented perhaps the most profound transformation that Thayan influence created in the broader world. As populations that had originally been motivated by ethical concerns gradually adopted pragmatic approaches that prioritized immediate benefits over abstract moral principles. The acceptance of slavery-produced goods by customers who would have been horrified by direct participation in slave ownership reflected the capacity for rationalization that economic incentives could create even among generally moral populations. The legacy of this commercial empire would ultimately prove more enduring and influential than any military conquest that Thay might have achieved through conventional means, creating dependencies and relationships that would survive political upheavals. and continue to serve Thayan interests long after the immediate circumstances that had created them had changed. The gold that flowed into Szass Tam's treasuries from these operations provided resources for future expansion, while the influence networks that supported them created capabilities for projecting power that would serve the undead realm for generations to come. The modern era of Szass Tam's reign, spanning from 1489 to the present day, represents the culmination of centuries of careful planning and patient accumulation of power that has transformed not only Thay itself, but the entire political and economic landscape of Eastern Faerun. The undead lich who once seized control through civil war and maintained his position through military might has evolved into something far more sophisticated and dangerous, a ruler whose influence extends through networks of dependency and corruption that make traditional forms of resistance virtually impossible, while creating the illusion that his dominance serves the greater good of all involved parties. The administrative structure that governs modern Thay bears little resemblance to the council-based system that once characterized Red Wizard politics, having been systematically transformed into a bureaucracy where undead functionaries carry out the detailed implementation of policies conceived by their immortal master. The efficiency that this system provides is undeniable, as administrators who never tire, never succumb to personal ambitions, and never question their instructions can maintain levels of coordination and consistency that would be impossible in any conventional government. The living Red Wizards who continue to serve within this system occupy positions that are simultaneously privileged and precarious, enjoying access to magical resources and research opportunities that are unavailable anywhere else, while remaining constantly aware that their continued existence depends entirely upon their usefulness to an immortal ruler whose perspective on mortality has been shaped by centuries of undead existence. The careful balance between reward and intimidation that maintains their loyalty has created a class of administrators who are both highly effective and profoundly corrupted by their participation in a system that treats human life as barn times Seth, merely another resource to be managed. The Doom Vault that serves as the nerve center for Szass Tam's dominion has expanded during this period into a vast underground complex that houses not only the Lich's personal facilities but also the administrative headquarters, research laboratories, and strategic planning centers that coordinate Thayan activities throughout the known world. The magical and technological innovations that have been incorporated into this facility during its ongoing expansion represent centuries of accumulated knowledge applied to creating the perfect environment for undead rule. The communication systems that link the Doom Vault to Thayan enclaves throughout Faerun operate through combinations of necromantic magic and shadow realm manipulation that provide instantaneous contact regardless of distance, while remaining virtually impossible for foreign intelligence services to intercept or decode. The information that flows through these networks provides Szass Tam with detailed knowledge of political developments, economic conditions, and social tensions throughout the regions where Thayan influence operates, creating an intelligence capability that surpasses anything that conventional governments could achieve. The research programs that continue to operate within the deepest levels of the Doom Vault have expanded beyond their original focus on necromantic innovation to encompass comprehensive studies of social control, economic manipulation, and the psychological techniques necessary for managing populations that have become dependent upon Thayan services. The discoveries that emerge from these programs are immediately implemented throughout the Enclave network, creating a feedback loop of continuous improvement in methods for extending and maintaining Thayan influence. The undead legions that once served primarily as military forces have been restructured during this period to function as comprehensive security and enforcement apparatus that maintains order throughout Thayan territory while providing rapid response capabilities for situations that require intervention beyond the normal scope of commercial operations. The integration of these forces with shadow magic techniques has created capabilities for covert operations that can project Thayan power into foreign territories without creating the diplomatic complications that conventional military action would generate. The slave populations that provide the labor foundation for Thayan prosperity have grown during this period to encompass not only the traditional captives acquired through warfare and raiding, but also voluntary immigrants who have been bowed. Attracted by promises of economic opportunity that gradually transform them into bonded laborers whose departure becomes increasingly difficult as their obligations accumulate. The sophisticated legal frameworks that govern these arrangements provide technical justification for practices that amount to slavery while maintaining the appearance of legitimate employment relationships. The magical item production facilities that serve as the foundation for Thayan commercial success have expanded during this period into an industrial complex that produces goods ranging from simple enhancement potions to bases co's amation to base industrial. Artifact-level devices whose capabilities approach the legendary items of previous ages. The quality control systems that ensure consistent product standards rely heavily on undead supervisors whose supernatural senses can detect flaws and variations that would escape mortal observation, while the security measures that protect trade secrets employ necromantic techniques that make industrial espionage virtually impossible. The Ziran addiction crisis that has spread throughout eastern Faerun during this period represents perhaps the most successful aspect of Thayan commercial strategy, as populations that have become dependent upon regular access to Ziran-enhanced magical items find themselves increasingly unable to function effectively without continued Thayan support. The medical complications that accompany Ziran withdrawal ensure that even customers who recognize the problematic nature of their dependency find discontinuation extremely difficult, while the personality changes that result from long-term usage make users more compliant and less likely to question the moral implications of their purchasing decisions. The international trade relationships that have developed around Thayan magical goods have created economic dependencies that extend far beyond individual customers to encompass entire regional economies that have restructured themselves around continued access to Thayan products. The cities that host major Thayan enclaves have become economically dependent upon the employment, tax revenue, and commercial activity that these facilities generate, while the surrounding regions have developed supply chains and service industries that support Thayan operations. The diplomatic influence that Thay exercises through these economic relationships often proves more effective than conventional statecraft in securing favorable policies from foreign governments. The rulers who have become dependent upon Thayan magical items for their personal security and enhancement find themselves reluctant to implement policies that might jeopardize their continued access to these resources, while the economic benefits that Thayan trade brings to their territories create political constituencies that actively support continued cooperation regardless of moral concerns. The cultural transformation that has accompanied decades of Thayan commercial influence represents perhaps the most profound change that Szass Tam's modern strategies have achieved, as populations throughout eastern Faerun have gradually adopted attitudes and practices that would have been considered morally unacceptable in previous generations. The normalization of slavery, the casual acceptance of necromantic enhancement techniques, and the erosion of traditional ethical constraints reflect the success of long-term programs designed to reshape cultural values in ways that make Thayan practices seem reasonable rather than abhorrent. The educational initiatives that Thayan enclaves sponsor in their host territories promote philosophical frameworks that emphasize individual achievement over collective welfare, while subtly undermining traditional sources of moral authority. The scholarships and research grants that support these programs attract promising young minds who receive world-class education in exchange for exposure to Thayan perspectives that gradually reshape their fundamental assumptions about ethics, governance, and the proper relationship between power and responsibility. The religious influence operations that have been developed during this period represent some of the most sophisticated aspects of Thayan cultural manipulation, involving the systematic promotion of theological perspectives that make necromantic practices seem more acceptable while weakening traditional prohibitions against commerce with undead entities. The interfaith dialogue programs that bring foreign clerics to study in Thayan libraries expose them to historical evidence and philosophical arguments that challenge their existing beliefs while providing access to magical enhancements that make return to their previous lifestyles increasingly unappealing. The technological innovations that continue to emerge from Thayan workshops represent advances in magical engineering that maintain the realm's competitive advantages while creating new categories of dependency among foreign customers. The communication devices that provide enhanced capabilities for long-distance coordination require regular maintenance that can only be performed by Thayan technicians, while the enhancement procedures that improve physical and mental capabilities create ongoing dependencies on follow-up treatments that ensure continued customer relationships. The environmental management programs that address the pollution and waste generated by intensive magical manufacturing represent both genuine environmental stewardship and sophisticated public relations initiatives that improve Thay's international reputation. The dimensional displacement techniques that transfer harmful byproducts to uninhabited Shadow Realm locations prevent environmental damage in populated areas, while the restoration projects that repair damage from previous industrial activities demonstrate Thayan commitment to responsible development practices. The next generation of Red Wizards who are currently advancing through Thayan educational institutions represent the culmination of decades of selective breeding programs and educational innovations designed to produce administrators who combine magical talent with the psychological characteristics necessary for effective service within an undead-ruled state. The indoctrination programs that shape their development ensure absolute loyalty to Szass Tam while providing them with the sophisticated skills necessary for managing increasingly complex international operations. The strategic planning initiatives that coordinate Thayan activities across multiple regions and timescales reflect Szass Tam's immortal perspective on political development and his recognition that sustainable influence requires patience and long-term thinking that extends far beyond the lifespans of mortal rulers. The contingency plans that have been developed to address various potential crisis scenarios demonstrate the thoroughness of Thayan preparation, while the adaptive mechanisms built into these plans ensure that changing circumstances will not disrupt fundamental strategic objectives. The economic warfare capabilities that Thay has developed during this period provide tools for destabilizing potential enemies without resorting to conventional military action while maintaining plausible deniability regarding their involvement in resulting political upheavals. The ability to manipulate commodity prices, create artificial shortages of essential goods, and coordinate market disruptions across multiple regions provides leverage that can bring down governments that might otherwise seem secure in their power. The intelligence penetration that Thayan operations have achieved within foreign governments, military organizations, and commercial enterprises provides detailed information about potential threats while creating opportunities for influence operations that can shape policy decisions in ways that serve Thayan interests. The agents who provide this intelligence often operate unknowingly, having been recruited through addiction to Thayan magical products or compromised through acceptance of gifts that create obligations and dependencies. The future vision that guides current Thayan development anticipates a world in which the distinction between Thayan territory and Thayan sphere of influence becomes increasingly meaningless, as economic and cultural dependencies create forms of control that are more comprehensive and sustainable than anything that military occupation could achieve. The success of this vision depends upon maintaining technological and magical advantages while gradually expanding the scope of essential services that foreign populations cannot obtain from alternative sources. The moral legacy of Szass Tam's reign represents perhaps the most troubling aspect of his success, as the gradual erosion of ethical constraints throughout Eastern Faerun has created conditions in which practices that would have been universally condemned in previous generations are now accepted as unfortunate necessities or reasonable compromises in pursuit of greater goods. The populations that have benefited from access to Thayan magical enhancements and economic opportunities have developed sophisticated rationalizations that allow them to ignore the human costs of their prosperity, while the competitive pressures created by Thayan commercial advantages force even ethical opponents to compromise their principles in order to remain economically viable. The international isolation that characterized earlier periods of Thayan history has been completely reversed during the modern era, as the realm has become so thoroughly integrated into the economic and political systems of Eastern Faerun that attempts to exclude or sanction it would cause more damage to its opponents than to Thay itself. The transformation from pariah state to indispensable partner represents perhaps Szass Tam's greatest strategic achievement, creating a situation where resistance to his influence requires sacrifices that few governments or populations are willing to make. The ultimate questions that arise from contemplating modern Thay's success concern the nature of progress, civilization, and the proper relationship between individual achievement and collective welfare. The undeniable advances in magical knowledge, economic efficiency, and administrative effectiveness that Szass Tam's reign has produced must be weighed against the human costs of a system that treats sentient beings as resources to be exploited rather than individuals deserving of respect and consideration. While the stability and prosperity that his rule provides for those who benefit from it must be balanced against the suffering of those whose exploitation makes such benefits possible. The chronicles of Thay remind us that the pursuit of power, however justified its beginnings, carries within it the seeds of corruption that can consume entire civilizations. From rebels fighting tyranny to tyrants perpetuating suffering, the Red Wizard's journey illustrates how noble intentions can be twisted by unchecked ambition and the intoxicating allure of dominance over others. Their mastery of magic, undeniable in its scope and sophistication, serves as both achievement and warning, a testament to mortal potential and a cautionary tale about the price of placing power above compassion. The transformation that began with Thay's desperate scribblings in hidden chambers ultimately created a civilization that achieved everything its founders had dreamed of, while simultaneously destroying everything they had originally claimed to value. The freedom from oppression that had motivated their rebellion against Mulhorandi rule became a new form of tyranny that was more efficient and more enduring than anything their former masters had devised. The magical knowledge that they had sought to preserve and advance became a tool for exploitation that reduced human beings to resources in equations of profit and power. The irony of their success lies in its completeness. The Red Wizards accomplished their stated goals of establishing wizard rule, advancing magical knowledge, and creating a prosperous society. Yet in doing so, they became everything they had once opposed. The systematic oppression they had fought against was replaced by systematic oppression they designed and administered, while the moral constraints they had rejected as impediments to progress were revealed to be the only forces capable of preventing their transformation into monsters. Szass Tam's personal journey from ambitious student to undead emperor encapsulates the broader tragedy of Thayan civilization, demonstrating how individual corruption can metastasize into institutional evil that outlasts any single lifetime. His achievement of literal immortality allowed him to pursue goals that required centuries of patience and planning, but it also isolated him from the human concerns that might have provided ethical guidance for his decisions. The lich who rules modern Thay is no longer capable of remembering what it felt like to be mortal, to fear death, to love another person, or to value anything beyond the abstract pursuit of power and knowledge. The economic empire that emerged from Thay's commercial expansion represents perhaps the most sophisticated form of imperialism ever developed, creating dependencies and relationships that make resistance both economically destructive and psychologically difficult for populations that have become accustomed to the benefits that Thayan goods provide. The voluntary nature of this subjugation makes it more effective than military conquest, while simultaneously making it more morally complex, as the victims of Thayan influence are also its beneficiaries in ways that complicate simple narratives of oppression and resistance. The Ziran addiction that has spread throughout eastern Faerun serves as a microcosm of the broader moral corruption that Thayan influence creates, demonstrating how individual choices made in pursuit of personal advantage can accumulate into collective dependencies that serve the interests of those who profit from human weakness. The customers who began using Thayan magical enhancements for their obvious practical benefits found themselves gradually transformed into something less than fully human. Their decision-making processes altered by chemical dependencies and psychological conditioning that made them increasingly compliant and decreasingly capable of moral reasoning. The cultural transformation that has accompanied decades of Thayan commercial influence represents the most insidious aspect of their success, as populations that were once capable of moral outrage at practices like slavery have gradually developed sophisticated rationalizations that allow them to participate in systems of exploitation while maintaining their self-image as ethical people. The erosion of moral standards has been so gradual and so thoroughly integrated with material benefits that most people no longer recognize the extent to which their values have been corrupted. The international community's response to Thayan influence reveals the weakness of moral principles when confronted with practical advantages and competitive pressures. The rulers who condemn Red Wizard practices in public while quietly purchasing their services in private demonstrate the capacity for self-deception that allows evil to flourish when good people prioritize immediate benefits over Bayesian teams. Long-term consequences. The merchants who facilitate Thayan trade, the scholars who accept Thayan research grants, and the officials who provide diplomatic protection for Thayan enclaves all participate in systems they claim to oppose because the costs of resistance seem higher than the costs of complicity. The technological and magical innovations that have emerged from Thayan research programs represent genuine advances in human knowledge and capability, yet they also demonstrate how progress can be achieved through means that corrupt the very purposes that progress is supposed to serve. The magical techniques that could heal diseases and extend human lifespan are used instead to create dependencies and control populations, while the organizational methods that could improve governance and reduce suffering are employed to make exploitation more efficient and resistance more difficult. The next generation of Red Wizards who are currently being educated in Thayan institutions represent both the perpetuation of existing patterns and the possibility of eventual change, as even the most sophisticated indoctrination programs cannot completely eliminate the capacity for moral reasoning that characterizes human consciousness. The young wizards who are being trained to administer Szass Tam's empire may eventually develop perspectives that their immortal master cannot anticipate or control, creating possibilities for internal reform that could transform Thayan society from within. The environmental and social costs of Thayan industrial operations have been carefully concealed from international view through magical techniques and diplomatic arrangements. But these costs continue to accumulate in ways that may eventually create crises that even Szass Tam's resources cannot manage. The Shadow Realm territories that have absorbed much of Thay's pollution and waste may eventually rebel against their exploitation, while the slave populations that provide the labor foundation for Thayan prosperity may develop new forms of resistance that prove more effective than previous efforts. The philosophical questions raised by Thay's success extend beyond simple moral condemnation to encompass fundamental issues about the nature of progress, the relationship between individual achievement and collective welfare, and the proper balance between order and freedom in human society. The stability and prosperity that Szass Tam's rule provides for those who benefit from it must be weighed against the suffering of those whose exploitation makes such benefits possible, while the advances in magical knowledge and administrative efficiency that his reign has produced must be evaluated against the human costs of the methods used to achieve them. The resistance movements that continue to operate against Thayan influence face challenges that go beyond simple military or political opposition to encompass the need to offer alternative visions of progress and development that can compete with the tangible benefits that Thayan systems provide. The moral arguments against slavery and exploitation must be accompanied by practical alternatives that can provide similar levels of prosperity and security without requiring the systematic dehumanization of vulnerable populations. The long-term sustainability of Szass Tam's empire remains questionable despite its current success, as systems based upon exploitation and dependency eventually create their own contradictions and sources of instability. The populations that have become dependent upon Thayan goods and services may eventually develop alternatives that reduce their vulnerability to economic manipulation, while the cultural changes that have made Thayan practices acceptable may eventually reverse as new generations rediscover values that their predecessors abandoned. The legacy of the Red Wizards will ultimately be determined not by their magical achievements or their political success, but by their impact on the moral development of human civilization and their contribution to, or detraction from, the ongoing project of creating societies that honor the dignity and potential of all people. The knowledge they have accumulated and the techniques they have developed could potentially be redirected toward constructive purposes if future generations can find ways to separate the valuable innovations from the corrupt systems that created them. The story of Thay serves as a reminder that the most dangerous forms of evil are often those that achieve their goals through means that appear reasonable and beneficial to those who profit from them, creating systems of oppression that are sustainable precisely because they provide genuine advantages to significant portions of the population. The challenge for those who would oppose such systems lies not in defeating them through force, but in developing alternatives that can provide similar benefits through means that respect rather than exploit human dignity. The crimson robes that once symbolized rebellion against tyranny have become the uniform of a more sophisticated form of oppression, one that achieves its goals through voluntary compliance rather than violent coercion. The transformation of the Red Wizards from freedom fighters to slave masters illustrates the eternal human struggle between the desire for power and the demands of conscience, a struggle that each generation must fight anew if civilization is to progress toward justice rather than merely toward efficiency. The future of Thay and its sphere of influence remains unwritten, dependent upon choices that have not yet been made by people who have not yet been born. The patterns established by centuries of Red Wizard rule will continue to influence regional development for generations to come, but they need not determine the ultimate outcome of humanity's ongoing experiment with organized society. The power that Szass Tam has accumulated could potentially be redirected toward constructive purposes, while the knowledge that his civilization has generated could serve the cause of human flourishing if future leaders can find ways to separate wisdom from wickedness. As you drift into peaceful sleep, carry with you the understanding that true strength lies not in the ability to control others, but in the wisdom to choose restraint, empathy, and justice even when unlimited power lies within reach. In the Red Wizard's Crimson Legacy, we find both the heights of magical achievement and the depths of moral failure, a reminder that our choices define us more than our capabilities ever could. The greatest magic is not the power to command elements or raise the dead, but the courage to remain human in the face of infinite temptation to become something less than what we were meant to be. The Chronicles of Thay remind us that the pursuit of power, however justified its beginnings, carries within it the seeds of corruption that can consume entire civilizations. From rebels fighting tyranny to tyrants perpetuating suffering, the Red Wizard's journey illustrates how noble intentions can be twisted by unchecked ambition and the intoxicating allure of dominance over others. Their mastery of magic, undeniable in its scope and sophistication, serves as both achievement and warning, a testament to mortal potential and a cautionary tale about the price of placing power above compassion. As you drift into peaceful sleep, carry with you the understanding that true strength lies not in the ability to control others, but in the wisdom to choose restraint, empathy, and justice even when unlimited power lies within reach. In the Red Wizard's Crimson Legacy, we find both the heights of magical achievement and the depths of moral failure, a reminder that our choices define us more than our capabilities ever could.